episode 120. If God exists, why is he so bad at showing it? This is Matthew, and in this episode I will be reviewing a Christian podcast which attempts to address the problem of God's hiddenness. But as you're about to hear, it descends into predictable chest-beating victim blaming. This is Christian apologetics at its utter worst. Rather than explain why God is justified in being hidden from you, this podcast tediously explains why it's all your fault for being a shitty person. And with that spoiler out the way, let's get started and have some fun. The podcast is called Christianity Still Makes Sense, and link 1 goes to the original episode.
If God exists, why doesn't he make it more obvious? I mean, this question has bothered believers and non-believers alike. Well, we tackle it and more on this episode of Christianity Still Makes Sense.
And my sarcasm button is ready, and my keyboard hammer is all fired up.
Welcome to the show that loves doubters.
I've listened to every episode of this podcast, and frankly, as a doubter, I do not feel loved.
We make sense of Christianity by making sense of the doubts that can deconstruct us with near apostate and now apologist Dr. Bobby Conway. I'm your host, Tim Hall.
I had a conversation with Tim back in episode 72. See the link at 2. In that episode, you will hear that he can't even bring himself to say that he accepts I used to be a Christian. But the thing that always makes me chuckle when I hear Tim's intro is how he has to state that Bobby is a near apostate. As if that's something to boast about. Does it somehow mean that he's more qualified to talk about certain subjects? Does it mean that Bobby has a special qualification to address my attitude to Christianity and why I hold it? The answer will become clear over the next 30 or more minutes. Oh, and by the way, did you know that I'm a near missionary? Oh, the joy.
Well, we look at stories of the Bible, and there are times that God has appeared in some seemingly obvious form. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Paul, and several others were exposed to God in such a way his existence was undeniable.
How dare you read those ancient stories laden with myth written by unknown authors about people of questionable historicity and doubt that God is real?
Well, why don't all of us, or at least those who doubt God's existence, get the same clear revelation?
If taking those ancient accounts as literal and accurate history is the evidential standard by which God is deemed to have revealed himself to us, then this is going to be even worse than you imagined it.
We are going to look at the topic of divine hiddenness, but we are going to do so addressing two audiences. The first audience is the non-believer, the second is the believer.
Does this mean that there will be two sets of statements put forth? One for those who are non-believers and another set for the doubting believers? Is God so fickle that his existence has to be adjusted according to who it is that is being addressed?
There are people who fail to believe in God because they don't think it's obvious enough that God exists.
I am very happy to count myself in this camp.
Then there are believers who believe, but they feel ghosted by God as they wonder, God, where are you?
And during the years that it took me to deconvert and deconstruct, this was the camp I was in.
Bobby, let's address the non-believers first this week by discussing the objection, if God exists, why doesn't he make it more obvious?
Why indeed. There are many serious doubters, and there are many vocal opponents to Christianity. If God really did zap Paul as described, then why can't he do that today? He would definitely get a large number of followers. I know I would change the tone of my podcasting if God revealed himself to me.
I think first off, as it relates to God's hiddenness, it wasn't always this way, Tim. God walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the garden. Who was hiding out? Well, they were. It was God saying, "Where are you?"
As a Christian, I was always taught that God is unchanging. So if God can be so casual at revealing himself to people back then, why is it so difficult to do that again now?
Nevertheless, in our post-fallen world,
the fall. Everything is the fault of the fall.
Our distortion field has been greatly limited, and we are spiritually impaired.
I'll be straight up honest, I have absolutely no fucking idea on what he's on about with regards to distortion field.
Now, some seem to sense God without a problem, while others claim they can't sense him at all. When we think about this, I've heard atheists claim that they want to believe, but God hasn't made it clear. They've asked, but it seems to no avail, so they argue.
This is true. There are atheists who have said this, and I believe them. In the years when I had my most troubling doubts, I literally begged God in prayer, many times, for help to believe. For him to reveal himself to me so that I could genuinely believe with confidence again. Go to any deconversion support group and you'll find people with a similar story. Why is it that when people doubt the most, God is the most silent? Something in the tone of Bobby's voice tells me that he's going to dismiss the integrity of those who want to believe but don't get the revelation they beg for.
What's the disconnect? I think the question we're asking at this stage, is God's hiddenness a strong enough argument to reject him on account of it, as some seem to have done?
Yes. The answer is yes. If you've been taught all your life that God exists and will answer your prayers and has a plan for your life, and then you find that you don't get any confirmation of that God's existence, then rejecting belief is absolutely a valid response.
Now, Michael Ray, a well-known Christian philosopher, in his Hiddenness of God book, he writes, the idea that divine hiddenness counts against the existence of God is largely a 20th century phenomenon.
Because not being able to find something is totally evidence that that thing exists.
Now, Ray is referring to this as a problem for non-believers. We all know that there have been Christians throughout the ages, and even in the Jewish culture as it relates to the Old Testament, that followers of Yahweh have wondered, God, where are you? But as an objection that non-believers seek to use to say God is not obvious enough, this is relatively new.
Whether it's a new thing or not, it shows that our intellectual integrity is progressing as time moved on. It is not a good reason to reject the idea just because it's new.
Ray goes on to write, the problem of divine hiddenness ranks alongside the problem of evil as one of the two most important and widely discussed reasons on offer for disbelieving in God.
Great. If it is so widely discussed, then maybe address it head on. Don't look for a reason to just dismiss it. That is intellectually dishonest.
Well, and I think that's exactly right. I just recently watched Matt Dillahunty, who's a pretty famous atheist, give a talk on divine hiddenness, and he echoes that same thing. He said, besides the problem of evil, and he goes out to lay out the problem of evil, God's hiddenness is the primary objection that him and a lot of people that are, kind of under his umbrella, people that follow him or watch his channel, say. But Bobby, there seems to be a few issues here, and I'm thinking of the sender problem and the receiver problem. Can you talk about that as we lay the groundwork for this discussion here?
So the question is this: has God, as the sender, not made himself clear enough, or is there a problem on the receiver's end? The scriptures depict the issue, obviously, not being with the sender, namely God, but with the receiver. That is, those humans who aren't receiving him.
Here it comes. It is totally your fault that the God who made you is incapable of making you in such a way that he is able to communicate with you effectively.
Now, as a sender, as you know, Tim, God has leveraged different ways of disclosing himself. First, through general revelation, and second, through special revelation. As we consider first general revelation, God's general revelation has been disclosed in both creation and conscience. So as it relates to creation, we see this, for example, in the Old Testament in Psalm 19, and in the New Testament in Romans 1, and as it relates to conscience in Romans 2. So like just for a few little snippets in Psalm 19, people could go on and read all of the verses 1 to 4. But how about the first verse? The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaim his handiwork. Or when we think about Romans chapter 1 and verses 18 to 20, just a few of the phrases we learn: for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived.
Clearly perceived by whom, Bobby? What's the methodology you use to determine that?
Ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. And then Paul says, so they are without excuse. So what we learn is the receiver can't blame the sender.
Yep, it's your fault that God won't talk to you.
That's as it relates to creation. But what about conscience? Well, as Paul shifts his argument in the next chapter of Romans, he talks about God's law being written on our hearts so that people would claim that they really can't know who God is. Well, their conscience convicts them. Their conscience accuses them.
How, Bobby? How, other than because the Bible tells you so, can you know that this is from God?
People can read those verses for themselves. Now, second, God has revealed himself through special revelation. So we considered real briefly, there's general revelation where God makes himself known through creation and conscience. But what about special revelation? This is where I'm thinking about the prophets or miracles, the incarnation, of course, the gospel as it relates to his death, burial, and resurrection, or God's word.
That's right. Ignore the fact that God won't talk to you. Just believe all those people who say that God has talked to them, because they are totally telling the truth. They would never try to stretch any kind of fact whatsoever. So believe them and ignore God's silence to you.
Now, in his book, Natural Signs and Knowledge of God, C. Stephen Evans, a philosopher, he shares some various natural signs of God as depicted in nature.
Surely if it's a natural sign, it must be an indication of the activities of nature.
And I would recommend this book as a helpful tool while discussing what he refers to in his book as a wide accessibility principle and the easy resistibility principle. So according to Evans, Tim, there is a wide accessibility principle. And that is to say that God has made himself known through general revelation, and that is widely accessible.
Great. Give me a reliable methodology by which I can access that and confirm it's from God.
Yet at the same token, it is easy for some to resist what he refers to as the easy resistibility principle.
If the evidence was so good, it wouldn't be so easy to resist the claim.
And I think that we'll get into more of things such as the fall and what causes people to resist him.
Oh, the fall. It's all the fault of the fall. You can't help it. It's the fall's fault.
So to Evans, God is widely accessible but can be resisted. And yet the Bible doesn't depict a sender problem.
Sure, the Bible says that. I'm not surprised. My concern is, how would I know that something written by motivated people could in any way be reliable?
The issue resides on the receiving end.
Yes, children, it's your fault. Definitely your fault. Always your fault. You could never do anything the right way. Shame on you.
So again, that no one will be without excuse.
Well, yeah, and I'm reminded of that verse in Psalm 114 that says, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. So that's
Right.
on the receiver end, not the sender end.
This is probably the worst possible verse to bring up in this context. It weaponizes the Bible as a tool of oppression. Never mind the fact that you have thought and agonized for a long time over your difficulty with belief. Never mind the many hours you've spent over months and even years praying and seeking God before reluctantly concluding God can't exist. Never mind the fact that you've done as much due diligence as you possibly can do. Never mind the fact that you have been as rational as you possibly can be in reaching this point. The Bible says you are a fool, and that is that. No true Christian will ever take you seriously because the Bible says you are a fool. And since God wrote the Bible and God also made you, he knows you are a fool, so tough shit. Suck it up, fool.
Well, now that you've exposed us to this sender-receiver problem, maybe you could elaborate a little bit more on this receiver problem that we have going on here and help us unpack it for the skeptics that claim that the problem is really the sender.
Sure, you bet. Now, the most well-known work on this has been put out by philosopher and atheist John Schellenberg,
See link 3 for the Wikipedia article on John Schellenberg.
who wrote an influential book called Divine Hiddenness in Human Reason. And in it, Schellenberg concludes that if an all-powerful God existed, then every reasonable non-resistant person would come to believe. So notice he calls this person a non-resistant individual, but he claims there are those who are non-resistant and don't believe. So he contends there must be a sender problem, right? Like if you've got somebody who's non-resistant, and if God has made himself widely accessible, like Evans maintains, then you wouldn't have people who are non-believers.
Or to go even further, if there are doubting believers who, having done everything they can to find the subject of their belief, but still end up no longer believing, then the problem must be elsewhere. Most likely, they have been misled or lied to.
Therefore, since we have non-believers as a result of non-resistant people, then the problem falls on the sender. Well, that might look like a difficulty for us, but Tim, as we'll unpack, I don't think there is. Schellenberg writes in his hiddenness argument on page 79, many people in our history have failed to believe in God without resistance of God in any way coming into the explanation of their non-belief. Now, again, to stay without resistance of God in any way is if we can really know that, right?
See that, folks? Bobby doesn't even believe that you can know that you are non-resistant. Fuck him.
Now, if God really desires a relationship, is all-powerful and loving, that should ensure a connection happens, right?
Yes.
That's kind of what Schellenberg is getting after. And yet, there are people who remain in a non-resistant state of non-belief.
Yeah, Bobby. Why is it so difficult for God to get to those people?
As a result, some atheist philosophers believe they've got a slam dunk argument against Christian theism. Now, let's try to consider Schellenberg's argument in syllogistic fashion.
Stand by for victim blaming.
In the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they provide a helpful syllogism of his argument. Premise 1 states, there are people who are capable of relating personally to God, but who, through no fault of their own, fail to believe. Premise 2, if there is a personal God who is unsurpassably great, then there are no such people. Well, here's the conclusion. There is no God. How in the world might we respond to this, Tim? Well, personally, I think the problem is with premise 1, where Schellenberg would state, through no fault of their own. As Ken Samples, a philosopher who has done a great job of popularizing philosophy for the laity, he states, just because a person is not persuaded by a given argument doesn't necessarily mean that the argument is defective logically.
That might be true, but it doesn't mean that it is the person's fault. It might mean that something else is required to get them persuaded, which means it's not their fault.
So there are various reasons, Tim, that we can object to Schellenberg. First, I think we could say that we can't assume the person who perceives himself as non-resistant is so entirely objective as to not be blinded by other things which may be blocking his ability to capture a peak of God as existing.
Let's say that's true. How is that their fault? If they can't see the blockage or do anything about the blockage, something else needs to happen in order to remove it. So therefore, it cannot be their fault.
Yeah.
Among things that could be blocking this person could be things such as presuppositions or unresolved traumas or disjointed rational conclusions.
And every single one of those things would need help from someone else to resolve if that is the problem. So still not their fault.
And all other sorts of influences. There can be a combination of rational, relational, social, emotional, and volitional conditions that impair one's ability to be fruitfully objective.
Let's imagine for a moment that there is a perfectly loving God who wants a relationship with me. But I, as a doubting believer, am struggling to connect with God for any of the reasons just mentioned. And let's say that I spend several years in my doubt trying multiple ways to establish that relationship, including many hours in prayer, fervent Bible study, and even counselling. And let's say that having done that, I find the stress of the search too much, and so I give up and conclude that God either does not exist or does not want to be in relationship. At what point in that process does it become my fault that I failed to find God.
We cannot underestimate the effects of the fall on our abilities to claim total non-bias and objectivity.
That's right. Your inability to think straight is because of the fall. But Bobby thinks straight because the fall doesn't affect him.
Besides this, Tim, I think that people who claim non-resistance need to be honest about themselves and say, am I really non-resistant to Christianity?
People struggling with doubt who desperately want to believe in God are not being resistant.
There are probably some things about the Christian story that such people don't like, and it could skew their sight.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of things like hell and sin and judgment and moral issues in the Bible.
And all of those things are things that feature in the doubts of people who desperately want to believe. Don't forget those people. They are not being resistant.
But one way of getting at their resistance, Tim, might be to ask them something like, so tell me, why is it that you don't believe in Christianity?
This is going to be a slightly longer comment because it feels like there is a category mismatch going on here. I suspect Bobby is referring to people who won't accept Christianity, while I am referring to people who were once Christians but now find themselves so conflicted with doubt that the only thing they can do to help themselves is to move further away from belief. If your concern as a listener is that at this point Bobby and I are addressing different groups, I understand. So let me address that. This subject is supposed to be about those who claim to be non-resistant to belief. And that category is met by those who did once believe and still want to believe, but find themselves in a position where belief is no longer possible. They are not actively rejecting belief. They are incapable of belief. Asking them why they don't believe is the wrong question. Instead, I suggest asking them what is preventing their belief. Unfortunately, I suspect Bobby and Tim are ignoring those people and instead focusing their attention on vocal critics like myself who are resistant to belief, for many valid reasons. More later. The thing is, in order to get from that fervent belief of Bobby and Tim to the active criticism of myself, you must pass through a period of being unable to believe despite desperately wanting to believe. This is the non-resistant belief that I am referring to. But it sounds like that group is being ignored in this discussion, which is unfortunate but not surprising. I imagine that those people are too awkward to address.
And at that point, we might get a brief download on some of their objections against Christianity. And guess what, Tim? It's then that we will have discovered that they're not so resistant after all.
Right. I think that's one of the interesting things, particularly about this non-resistant non-believer thing. So I'll make 2 points, and then I do have several follow-up questions because this is fantastic. I think for me, when I'm talking to atheists and they bring this up, it's saying, well, you don't trust me as the atheist to tell you that I'm non-resistant.
Full disclosure here. I've engaged with Tim quite a lot over the past few years on the Unbelievable Facebook group, and this is exactly how I feel about Tim. I don't think he trusts or believes anything I say, no matter how truthfully I say it. And likewise, as somebody who did once trust and respect him, I find that has waned significantly, and I frankly do not trust him to be honest about me.
And we're like, well, on some level, yeah, but as you just so artfully laid out, there are some issues that kind of come up that we just don't know, those traumas or other things that kind of happen. So I think this is really interesting. But okay, so I have another question for you. Do you think if God made himself more evident, that more people would believe?
Yes, I do.
Well, some people would want to argue that way, but I don't think it's that easy, Tim. That is to say, I don't think a lack of revelation is our biggest problem. More revelation might not equate to belief. Who had more revelation than Satan before his fall, right?
Right.
Demons believe and shudder.
They're not atheists, though. They are simply people who recognize God for the great big dick that he is.
And so having, revelation of God doesn't mean we'll necessarily serve him. Nobody got more of a glimpse of God's glory than Satan and the angelic realm. And a third of the angels would rebel against God. Why? Because of their free will.
Bobby, you're equivocating. This is about people who can't believe God exists, not people who are aware that God exists, but just think he's a dick.
Think about it. God parted the sea, and shortly after, it was Mardi Gras at Mount Sinai.
Huh?
I think a question we can ask is this. Is God required to be more obvious?
It would definitely be useful. I mean, we do know that absent parents end up being unliked by their children.
And I don't think so. Besides, he wants something bigger and more from us than just belief.
If God wants more from us, but has made us so that we're not capable of giving more without some kind of personal revelation or presentation, then whose fault is it?
As I mentioned, the demons have that.
They're also not resisting belief. They do believe he exists.
He wants our life.
Then it's up to him to do something about it.
And not only that, if he was more obvious and people still did reject him, Tim.
Yeah, so I think that's good. Man, I think we have to kind of begin to start wrapping this up. We got a few minutes left. Would you concede the point that God is sometimes hidden, though?
Absolutely, Tim. I mean, for believers, sometimes God does seem to be remote, and we go through a dark night of the soul. We ask God, where are you?
These are the people I was referring to. Come on, address that. Get to the mentality of those people. Help them out in their pain, Bobby.
But God has a purpose for that. And
he's a sadistic cockwomble. That's his purpose.
Absolutely. I do think we also need to be careful with the analogies that we use to talk about God as a person who's like a father to us. While he is, his transcendence makes that definition of our human father relationship different. So people end up getting disillusioned by God if they think there's a one-to-one correspondence in the way that God would relate to us as a human father. He's not a human father. He's a transcendent father who's immanent with us, but we don't always sense that immanence.
His ways are mysterious, and despite wanting a relationship with you, when he goes silent, it's just the way he is. Deal with it.
In your, conversations you've had with people in your season of doubt, what do you think is the greatest reason that people might give for not thinking God is obvious enough?
Well, it can be things like I prayed and it didn't work out, or I didn't sense God's presence.
That's right. Right often minimize all the effort that people go into in order to try to find God.
But I think the biggest thing, Tim, is the suffering in the world that people go through.
That is certainly a very valid objection.
They'll use that as an excuse to basically say, you know what, obviously God's not really there, because if he was loving and he is all powerful, then he would intervene and he would show up.
No, it's not used as just an excuse. It is a very valid concern because it goes against what people have been taught for the entirety of their lives about the way God behaves. And this evidence that they see in a world full of pain and suffering goes against what they've been taught to believe. So this contradiction, this conflict, causes a genuine and serious problem of doubt in their minds, and they can't help it, and they need to find an answer. It is absolutely not just an excuse, and to label it as just an excuse shows that you're being dishonest about the concerns and the reasons that people have.
And you have people like Elie Wiesel in his book Night, who talks about seeing the horrors during the midst of Holocaust and his faith being incinerated, so to speak. This has been a lot of people's story. But not only that, there have been other people, Tim, who have been through tremendous amounts of suffering. And it was in those moments where they went deeper into God.
Great. Good for them. And when I don't dismiss them and the intellectual integrity that they went through, don't dismiss the intellectual integrity which people have when they don't come to the same conclusion. And if people do go through that pain and go through that doubt and don't come to the same conclusions, maybe there's a bigger picture here that needs to be addressed. But to dismiss the side that doesn't come to your conclusion is to be dishonest.
Yeah, and so I think, to kind of wrap this all up, you've mentioned a few resources. What are some of the other, kind of resources that you might recommend? And I might chime in here with some resources as well to people that are kind of struggling with this divine hiddenness issue. Is this non-resistant, non-believer kind of person, what would you say to that person who thinks that he's non-resistant and wants to encounter God? They're watching, they're checking this episode out, maybe they're listening on the radio. What would you say to them?
Shocking example of victim blaming incoming.
I think I would share a few things. First off, I would say don't underestimate our ability to be skewed, to be blurred. We can all be in a position, myself included, where we have biases and we can't assume that we're objective.
Sure, we all like to think that we can be objective or even are objective, but sometimes we don't see past that. But the question is, how do we tell the difference?
Second, I would say ask yourself, what is it that you're looking for? And are you being realistic?
The truth. I just want to know the truth. And so do those who believe but have doubts. They just want to know the truth too. Asking for validation that God exists is the first step in that search. If you assume God exists and then criticize those who question that as expecting too much, then I challenge your objectivity. Maybe you're the one with the wrong presupposition. When you dismiss those who need confirmation that God exists as expecting too much, you become the bad guy. You are the abuse enabler. You are the one telling the victim it's their fault for having doubts. These doubts exist because the experience of living in the world does not match the promises from the pulpit. It is not my fault that Christianity failed to live up to expectations. If the Christian God does in fact exist, and does want a relationship with me, and did in fact die for my sins, then it is not my fault that when I tried to have that relationship, it was utterly one-sided and left me bereft of the love I needed. That is abuse by neglect. If I can recognise that in an earthly relationship, why do Bobby and Tim fail to recognise that in a supposedly perfect spiritual relationship? The Christian who finds themselves in that position is not being resistant. They are actively seeking a reassurance from a God they believe exists and are utterly ignored. Saying they expect too much is victim blaming. I know that Tim would call me a resistant non-believer now, and would use that to dismiss any request I make for evidence for God as an excuse to avoid belief. But what Tim is conveniently ignoring is that when I did still believe and desperately sought God and got nothing, I was not being resistant. Every former believer who is now atheist went through that same stage of trying to believe and failing. None of those ex-Christians stopped believing because they were resistant. None of those ex-Christians stopped believing because they wanted to sin. Each of those former Christians is now atheist because the God who promises that if they sought, they would find, and he failed them. For Bobby and Tim to say it is their fault is why I view Christianity with the disdain that I do. It enables this abusive thinking. It encourages finger-pointing at the victim and it protects the abuser. When you give God a special pass for letting people down, then it is easier to give people a special pass for letting others down. And that is why churches have so many abuse scandals. The effect of that is that more and more doubting Christians are seeing God as abusive and leaving the church. When you blame the ex-Christian for God's failures, then it is only a short step to blame the abused wife for the husband's failures. If you have doubts and no one else can help you, then call freedom from religion and run the fuck away from that church. Contact details in the show notes.
Like expecting God to do something for you that he doesn't do for others who do believe.
They're not asking for things that he doesn't do for others, though. That's the point, Bobby.
I would want to say, like, have you set the bar so high for what you expect God to do for you to convince you?
Imagine having the audacity to think that a perfect God would at least do what he promises to do in his own word. Imagine that.
You'll always have a finger to point. Why should you think that you should be able to set the standard for what it is that God has to do to convince you that he exists?
If God isn't prepared to do the simplest thing to convince me that he exists, why should I expect anything else from him? Step one, Bobby. Step one.
There does seem to be plausible evidence. I mean, the person who's saying there's not evidence, well, they're just denying the evidence.
That may be so. There might well be some people who, given good evidence for the existence of God, simply refuse to accept it. But there are many, many more who, when given suitable evidence, would believe. And if those people won't get convinced, then maybe, just maybe, Bobby, what you think is evidence isn't actually evidence at all.
They might not feel the evidence, Tim, but the evidence is empirical. I mean, it's there. I mean, I'm thinking of things like DNA,
which contains quantifiable evidence of natural processes like evolution and no signature of God found.
the fact that nothing pops into existence out of nothing.
That's how nature works, Bobby. Things popping into existence out of nothing is what God does. Have you not read the first chapter of Genesis?
Systemic, ubiquitous, religious experience.
Every made-up religion in the world contains this kind of thing. We know humans make shit up.
Near-death experiences.
The brain does some very strange things when it starts to degrade and get starved of oxygen. And weird thing, near-death experiences always seem to comport with the religious knowledge of the person that experiences it. It's like the brain is just rehashing what it already knows. Weird.
Objective morality.
Except that morality is individual and determined by the subject being examined.
The resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Probably the most contested and questioned miracle of all time.
Answers to prayer.
Except for the prayers of those who were doubting and begged God for a sign that he existed and got nothing. Those prayers weren't answered. Silly me, I forgot. Those people were expecting too much.
I mean, while you can reject some of this, you just can't come and wipe it all away. Like,
oh yes, I can when it's not sufficiently backed up, and these are all not sufficiently backed up.
you can't just say there has never been a prayer answered, right? Because to say that there's no God means there has never been one prayer answered.
That's right. If there is no God, not one prayer has been answered. But I tell you what, there has been a shit ton of coincidences, and we know those happen on a daily basis.
To say there is no God means there has never been one miracle.
That's right. If there is no God, there has not been one miracle. And yet, every single miracle claim, when it gets examined to the detail, falls apart, ends up on shaky ground, ends up being not good enough to convince a skeptic. Why would that be, Bobby, if there really is a God?
To say that there is no God means that there's no such thing as a near-death experience where you could be in a conscious state, though pronounced brain dead.
And like miracles, every NDE, once examined to detail, falls apart. And as already said, we know that the brain does weird things when close to death.
That is such a massive claim.
Yes, Bobby, you have made a really massive claim.
That I think that we are far more rational to believe that something is going on in a divine sense, because most of the world has always said God has been making himself known.
And yet, interestingly, I think, as time moves on and we learn more and more, the amount of people who are convinced God exists become fewer and fewer.
Cross-culturally, young, old, disabilities, people who are healthy, rich, poor. This is something that this weak minority, 5%, is saying this. I just want to say, maybe they're not as objective as they think.
Yeah, those who want just a bit more so that they can validate and confirm the belief are the ones not being objective. Nice call, Bobby.
Another thought would be for them to ask themselves, I would say, what are your objections to Christianity?
Poorly evidenced claims and testimonies that simply do not match reality. Oh, and really shitty behavior too.
And then I would listen. And then I would say, after listening to their objections, I would say, how can you say you're non-resistant?
Okay, fine. I will, for this moment in time, accept the charge of being resistant non-believer. But, important but, address the period of 3 years when I was doubting and trying very hard to believe. Address that period, Bobby.
You just shared with me your objections to Christianity. You just revealed to me that you're not resistant. You just shared with me why you're resistant.
That's right. All these objections about Christianity being an utter, total failure are simply irrelevant because Bobby says I'm a resistant non-believer. Great.
And then I would say, don't quit seeking. Humbly ask God to help you, even with your unbelief.
But I've done that. How many more times do I need to do it before it's okay to say, all right, I give up. The expected result ain't gonna happen?
But nevertheless, Tim, I would say don't set a time limit on this.
Why not?
You don't know how long this is going to be. Some people go, well, God didn't show me by this date, so I quit believing. Well, if you're still alive, you have time to keep seeking.
Oh, fuck's sake, this is abuse apologetics again.
And so you need to keep seeking because you don't have the right to check out and then think you're going to stand before God and say, like Bertrand Russell said, not enough evidence.
No, wrong. If God doesn't live up to his promises, then check out. Otherwise, you're just maintaining poor mental health. That's going to be bad for you in the long run. Have a good life, live the best life you can, and if that means without God causing you strife and grief, then live it without God.
Finally, I'd say, well, you may not have the experiential sense of contact. Don't underestimate the evidential component. Just because God's presence isn't obvious doesn't mean his presence is non-existent.
Great. Give me the repeatable methodology by which I can gather some evidence so I can confirm the existence of God for myself.
And so the gospel is a powerful case for God's love. If anyone wants to argue, Tim, that God hasn't shown his love to humanity, well, look no further than the cross.
Written down accounts of questionable authorship from 2,000 years ago do not constitute evidence.
He has shown it. And if Jesus rose from the grave, and I think the arguments in favor of his resurrection are much superior than the arguments that are against it.
Evolved fictional narrative over several decades will always be a better explanation than a God created an imperfect world so that it could create a punishment regime by which a small fraction of the beings in that created world can live in eternal worship of that God. And what's more, we actually have examples of human-created fictional narrative.
We would be far more rational to believe in the arguments for the resurrection than the silly, weak arguments against the resurrection. If that's the case that Jesus rose from the grave, then that means he really did die. And if he really did die, that means he did give us a demonstration of tremendous love.
If Jesus really did die for us as an act of tremendous love, but God can't, or won't, do a little thing like help you and me to have the knowledge we need in order to maintain belief that he exists, then he is not a loving God. He is an abusive, manipulative, ass-munching cock-goblin. And we are right to not want anything to do with him.
And therefore, for anybody who wants to say that God is hidden, Jesus is the example that God has broke into our world to save us. There is no one who will be without excuse.
And yet, increasing numbers of Christians, people who once believed, probably believed a bit like Bobby, like I did, are becoming more and more convinced that the whole shebang is invented fiction.
Bobby, any final words or comments before we wrap today's show up?
I think that we need to be sympathetic to people who are struggling with discovering God, so to speak.
Now you want to be sympathetic? After 20 minutes vomiting up shit about how it's all their fault, you now want to be sympathetic towards them? Tell us, Bobby, how are you going to be sympathetic? What actions do you recommend concerned friends and relatives take? What kind words do you have to say to them, Bobby? I mean, you are a near apostate, aren't you? You must have an experience to share or an understanding word that could help them in their doubt. What would you say, Bobby?
I do think there are genuine people who believe that they have been seeking God and God's not showing up, so to speak.
You do believe that there are people who do believe that they have been seeking God. Okay, right, well, that's nice, I suppose.
But I think that through a friendship, we can have conversations about maybe their traumas, maybe their disillusionment.
And maybe those things are too painful for them to talk about and they just want a friend.
Maybe some of the expectations. And we can say things like, well, have you considered that maybe, look, you put a time limit on this?
And there it is, the shit-posting vomit turd. Come on, Bobby. Sympathy. Not accusation and making it their fault again. Fucking gaslighters.
So I think about Cosmic Skeptic, and he's like, look, I don't see myself as non-resistant, but God didn't do anything to show up.
Yeah, he might not be non-resistant now, and the same might apply to me now, and the same might apply to many other atheists and former Christians now. But What about the period when they were non-resistant? Those are the ones you're trying to be sympathetic about. Isn't that what she said, Bobby? Why have you skipped past being sympathetic and gone straight to attacking the ones that you don't like the most? Are you bored of this yet?
Well, look at how young Cosmic Skeptic is.
Right.
Oh no, how terrible. He's so young.
It's silly for him at such a young age to think that, well, he's exhaustively been through this thing and now he's just going to spend his life promoting atheism. I don't think that is the wise approach. I would say keep seeking.
Keep seeking for how long, Bobby? This is fake it till you make it theology. Well, fuck that. If it's hurting you, if it's causing you pain, if it's causing you distress, get the hell out.
And I'm not sure that when we say we've sought him, that we really seek him.
And there it is again. If you don't find God, it's your fault because you didn't try hard enough. Well, fuck that. God knows we're looking. He can show up.
I know how hard it is for me to pray, Tim. It can be exhausting.
Yes, it can. I've been there. I know that too. So have some sympathy, Bobby.
Amen to that.
You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.